Snowstorms don't just trap people. They capture feelings, ideas, and decisions you would never make. I learned this lesson firsthand on a frigid December evening at the family cabin. My husband, Thomas, was called away for business at the last minute, so I went up to the cabin alone to inspect everything before the next storm arrived. Jack, his son from a previous marriage, offered to assist, stating that he could use the fresh air. At the time, I didn't give it much thought. However, the storm hit sooner than predicted, and snow accumulated so swiftly that escaping was impossible. The cabin's antiquated heater sputtered and died, leaving only a tiny fire to keep us warm. At night, it was nearly as chilly inside as it was outdoors. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can keep giving you intriguing, genuine tales like these. Don't forget to watch this video till the conclusion. And, like the video, this is extremely intriguing. Please click the like button to express your support. We need to save heat, Jack explained, his breath apparent in the faint light. We grudgingly grabbed blankets on the couch and sat together. It seemed weird and intimate at first, but as the hours passed, the cold made us forget our discomfort. The storm howled outside, snow fell mercilessly, and the fire weakened. By dark, the furnace had entirely ceased operating. We gathered close, covered in blankets, attempting to retain whatever warmth we could. "I guess it's colder in here," I remarked, tightening my blanket. Jack nodded grimly across from me. He said, "It is. If the fire goes out, we will freeze." His remarks, unrelated to the weather, sent a shiver through me. The storm had taken us off guard. There is no electricity, no mobile service, and no way to leave. Jack stood to add more wood to the fire. He looked at me and remarked, "This should keep us warm for a little while, but we need to stay close to keep our bodies warm." I hesitated, wondering what to say. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, serious yet understanding. "We swap blankets till the storm has passed." I wanted to reject, to say we'd be all right, but the cold was unmistakable, and I knew he was correct. "Okay," I said gently. He said gently, heaviest blankets he could find, and spread them on the couch. I joined him and sat awkwardly next to him. "Is this okay?" he asked, his tone cautious. I nodded and avoided his sight. "That's okay." It seemed horrible at first, both physically and emotionally. I was conscious of every inch of distance between us, but as the hours passed, the cold pushed us closer together. I began to feel less aware of the strain. "Better?" Jack inquired gently, his breath apparent in the dark lighting. "Yes," I said, but my voice quivered. The quiet became thick, broken only by the sound of the wind outside. Finally, Jack spoke. "The storm is worse than I expected," he remarked. I nodded. "It's been years since I've seen something like this." He leaned back with a serious gaze. "I used to like going up here as a youngster. My mom and I would stay for days together." He mentioned his mother, which startled me. Jack seldom spoke about her. "You must have been close," I responded. "Yeah," he said, a little smile pulling on his lips. "She made this apartment feel like a home." I felt an ache in my chest. I attempted to fill that position after marrying Thomas, but I always felt like an outsider. "I apologize if I didn't measure up," I said softly. Jack glanced at me, perplexed. "What do you mean?" "I know I'm not her," I stuttered, "and I understand how difficult it has been for you to have me in your life." He shakes his head. "Ava, you've been kinder to me than I deserved." The candor in his speech caused my breath to catch. Time passed and the fire became weaker. Jack moved closer, tightening the covers around us. "Cold?" he inquired. "I am okay," I said, my teeth trembling slightly. "Here," he replied, placing his arm around me. At first, I tensed, but the warmth was palpable. As the chill subsided, I gradually leaned into him. "You're like a human heater," I said, attempting to relieve the strain. He chuckled. "I guess I'm for something." We sat in quiet for a minute, the storm raging outside, and the intimacy of the situation seemed overpowering. As the night progressed, I became more comfortable with Jack, and the walls between us began to slip away. "Tell me something about yourself," he requested abruptly. I looked up at him, shocked. "Like what?" "Anything," he said. "Something I don't know." I thought for a moment. "I used to want to be a painter," I explained, "but life got in the way. I got a job, and I let my ambitions slip away." Jack's expression relaxed. "You did not have to abandon what makes you happy." His comments aroused something in me that I hadn't felt in a long time. "How about you?" I inquired, shifting the subject. "What did you wish to become?" He grinned slightly. "An architect. I used to create detailed blueprints for homes and castles. My mother always claimed I had the imagination for it." "What happened?" I asked. He exhaled. Life got in the way. His sentiments resembled mine, and I sensed an unsaid kinship between us, a shared sense of loss for unfulfilled goals. The storm was over by the next morning. Sunlight streamed through the glass windows, sending a golden glow over the icy countryside. Jack was already awake, stirring the fire to life. As I sat back up, he returned my gaze. "Morning," he said pleasantly. "Morning," I answered, tightening the blanket. The uneasiness from the night before reappeared, but this time it was about the unsaid tension between us, rather than the discomfort. "We should be able to go once the roads are free," he said nonchalantly. "Good," I answered immediately, despite the fact that I didn't want to leave the cabin's warmth. Later, as we prepared to leave, I couldn't help but wonder if the storm had changed our relationship, or if I was just imagining it. When we returned home from the cabin, I expected the stress to subside. But as we unpacked our belongings and nestled back into our comfortable surroundings, I recognized something had changed. Jack began to avoid me, withdrawing to his room or leaving the home for extended periods of time, only communicating when spoken to. I told myself that the distance would put us back to normal, but I couldn't stop feeling my stomach clench whenever I saw him in the corridor or heard his voice from another room. One evening, when I was cleaning the dishes, Jack came in. He lingered in the doorway as if wondering whether to depart. "Is everything okay?" I asked, attempting to maintain a cheerful tone. "Yes," he responded, walking inside. "I simply wanted to say thank you for handling everything at the cabin." I wiped my hands, shocked at his truthfulness. "You do not need to thank me," I said. "You are the one keeping us alive." He chuckled gently. "I still appreciate it." Our gazes locked for a brief period, and I sensed a renewed connection between us. The tipping moment occurred late one night. My mind was racing, and I couldn't fall asleep. I went downstairs to prepare tea and discovered Jack in the dimly lit living room, reading a book. "Are you up late?" I replied, shocked. He looked up. His countenance softened. "Couldn't sleep," I stated as I sat across from him. "Neither do I." We sat silently for a time, with the clock ticking in the background. Finally, Jack closed his book and leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "May I ask you something?" he replied cautiously. "Of course," I responded. "Did it feel different in the cabin?" The question hung in the air, full of significance. My pulse raced as I weighed my response. "Yes," I muttered, and Jack nodded slowly, lowering his gaze. I assumed it was just me, but it wasn't. I responded, my voice barely audible. The stillness that followed felt deafening, and neither of us moved to break it. Jack eventually stood and sat alongside me. He continued, "I don't want to make things harder for you, but I can't stop thinking about it." I admitted, hesitantly, that I didn't either. I did not stop him from leaning in. At first, the kiss was cautious, but it quickly intensified, and I realized we had crossed a boundary. After that night, we attempted to avoid one another, pretending nothing had occurred, but the attraction was too strong. Jack and I were alone in the kitchen one evening after Thomas had departed for a week-long excursion. The air between us crackled with tension. "We can't keep doing this," I replied as my voice faltered. "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer. "No one needs to know." "It's not that simple," I murmured, leaning against the counter. "It may be," he said, his hand brushing across me. When his lips touched mine again, all my doubts vanished. Our relationship became increasingly convoluted, and we found it difficult to keep the secret. I became hyper-aware of the people around us, especially Clara, who began to notice changes in my behavior. "You appear different," she said one morning, her eyes narrowing in alarm. "More alive." I laughed and tried to brush it off. "I've just gotten more sleep. Maybe there's someone or something you're not telling me about," she taunted, her eyes knowingly piercing. Her comments stayed with me. The tension increased, as did Greg's interest regarding Jack. During a dinner party, Greg confronted Jack in the kitchen. "So, Jack," Greg asked, swirling his guava, "what is it like being here with Ava?" Jack replied cautiously. "It's all right," he responded warily. "Just good," Greg said, his voice light but probing. Greg smirked as he said, "She is a lovely woman." I withdrew myself before the conversation became heated, but I knew Greg suspected something more. As time progressed, our covert connection grew more difficult to hide. Jack and I started sneaking around more regularly, grabbing moments whenever we could. One evening, as we sat in the garden, Jack turned to me, his look solemn. "What are we doing, Ava?" he inquired. I sighed and stared at the starry flowers. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I really don't want to harm anyone." "You're not," he replied immediately. "But this is complex." He grabbed for my hand, gripping it firmly. "I am willing to take the chance if you are." His comments sparked a combination of exhilaration and terror within me. I knew the risks, but I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Our lives had taken on a second life. We pretended to be a normal family throughout the day, and Thomas had no idea. At night, we tiptoed around one another, experiencing fleeting moments that felt like gold. The exhilaration was clear, as was the peril. Each exchanged gaze or touch held the weight of 1,000 questions. Who'd notice? Who would tell? So what would happen if they did? One afternoon, when Thomas was working, Jack and I were alone in the living room. The sunshine flowed through the drapes, giving the room a lovely golden hue. I sat on the couch, absorbed by my thoughts, as Jack rested on the armrest next to me. His hand touched mine. I looked uncomfortably at the door and said, "Someone might come home." Clara texted. Jack responded, "She's taking Thomas to the fundraiser." His comments provided me with confidence, allowing me to relax for a time. But as Jack got closer, the sound of the front door opening made my pulse race with fear. "Ava," Thomas's voice called from the hallway. We scrambled apart, my pulse pounding as Thomas walked into the room. He stopped in the doorway, his brow furrowing slightly. "What's going on in here?" he asked, his eyes darting between the two of us. "Just reading," I said quickly, holding up my book as if it could shield me from his gaze. Jack nodded, maintaining his calm expression. I was just about to head out. Thomas stared at us for a long moment, then shrugged. "All right?" I thought I heard voices. Once he left the room, I let out the breath I had been holding. That was too close, I whispered to Jack, feeling the weight of the situation. Too close. Jack agreed, his jaw tight. The following days became more complicated. Greg's behavior grew more invasive. His curiosity about Jack seemed to intensify after Thomas mentioned that his son was staying with us. One evening, during a dinner party at our house, Greg cornered Jack in the kitchen. "So, Jack," Greg said, swirling his wine glass, "what's it like staying here with Ava?" Jack's posture stiffened, and he glanced briefly at me across the room. "It's fine," he replied cautiously. "Just fine?" Greg pressed. "She's a lovely woman, isn't she?" Jack clenched his jaw. "She is," Greg smirked, clearly relishing the discomfort he was causing. "I hope you're not giving her too much trouble." Before the conversation could escalate, I stepped in, keeping my tone polite but firm. "Greg, do you mind helping Thomas in the dining room?" "Of course," Greg said with a half smile before leaving the room. I turned to Jack once we were alone. "What was that about?" "Nothing," Jack replied, though his expression told a different story. He's just being Greg. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg suspected more than he let on. As our relationship continued, it became harder to keep the secret from those around us. Jack and I found ourselves sneaking around more often, sharing stolen moments in the early mornings or late at night. One evening, as we sat together in the garden, Jack turned to me, his expression serious. "What are we doing, Ava?" he asked again. I stared at the moonlit flowers, unsure of how to respond. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I don't want to hurt you." "You're not," he said, but the weight of the situation was clear in his eyes. "This is complicated." He reached for my hand, his grip strong and reassuring. "I'm willing to risk what you are." Despite the risks, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. We persisted in our covert relationship, leading a double life, with every moment of illicit love heightening the risks. When Thomas was around, we assumed the role of a normal family, but at night, we navigated a world teeming with secrets, constantly on guard, wondering when everything would crumble. One afternoon while Thomas was at work, Jack and I found ourselves alone again. The sunlight streaming through the curtains seemed to bring a sense of calm, but I knew it was just an illusion. Jack leaned beside me, his hand brushing mine again. "I'm not sure how much longer we can keep this up," I whispered. My voice tinged with anxiety. He nodded, his expression grave. "We'll figure it out, but we can't keep pretending nothing's going on." Just then, the sound of the front door opening again made us freeze. "Ava?" Thomas's voice called from the hallway. My heart dropped into my stomach as we quickly pulled apart, the weight of our actions hanging over us like a cloud. Thomas walked into the room, oblivious to what had just happened. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between the two of us. "Just reading," I said, trying to keep my composure. I grabbed a nearby book, trying to appear normal. Jack nodded in agreement, though his eyes showed the underlying tension. I was about to head out. Thomas gave us a curious look before shrugging. "All right." Once he left, I could feel the panic fading, but the guilt remained. Jack and I exchanged a glance, the unspoken words lingering in the air. We both knew that this was only a temporary reprieve. As the days wore on, the tension continued to rise. Greg started noticing things. Strange glances, awkward silences, and his behavior became more suspicious. Finally, it reached a breaking point when Thomas confronted me one evening. "Ava, what's going on?" he asked, his voice full of doubt. I froze, taken aback by the question. "What do you mean?" "You've been acting strange," Thomas said, his tone growing more insistent. "And Jack? He's been acting strange too. Is there something I should know?" The weight of his words settled on me, and I knew that it wouldn't be long before the truth came out. The strain of keeping our secret relationship became too much to bear. Jack and I had reached a breaking point, and the constant tension weighed on us both. Our stolen moments, the looks we shared, the closeness we tried to hide, it was becoming unbearable. One evening, after another close call, we found ourselves arguing in the kitchen. "This is getting too dangerous," I said, my voice rising. "Someone is going to figure it out." Jack stepped closer, his expression softening. "We can handle it." "Can we?" I countered, my frustration boiling over. "It feels like everything is falling apart." Jack's voice was steady, but his eyes reflected the same fears I had. "I don't want to lose you, Ava." "I don't want to lose you either," I admitted, feeling the weight of the situation. But even as we reconciled, I couldn't shake the feeling that our time together was running out. The breaking point came one afternoon when Thomas returned home unexpectedly during one of our secret moments. Jack and I had been in the garden. Our voices were low as we discussed our next steps. "We need to stop this," I said, my voice trembling. "It's getting too risky." "Do you really want to stop?" Jack asked, his eyes searching mine for an answer. Before I could respond, the sound of Thomas's voice made us jump. "Ava," he called out from inside. We scrambled apart, panic rising in my chest as I heard his footsteps approaching. "Just getting some air," I said quickly. Forcing a smile as Thomas appeared in the doorway, his eyes narrowed, studying us both carefully. "What's going on out here?" "Just talking," I said, trying to keep the situation calm. Thomas gave us a suspicious look, but after a long moment he shrugged. "All right." And then, without another word, he left the room. As I exhaled in relief, I couldn't help but feel the walls closing in on us. I whispered to Jack, "That was too close." "I know," he agreed, his jaw tight with frustration. The next day, Greg's interference escalated even further. He showed up unannounced at the house, his demeanor smug as he greeted Thomas. "Greg," Thomas said, surprised by his sudden appearance. "What brings you by?" "Oh, I just thought I'd check in," Greg said, his gaze darting between Jack and me, clearly studying us. "I've been noticing some intriguing dynamics around here lately." My stomach sank at his words. But Thomas, oblivious to the tension, laughed it off. "Greg, you've always been one for gossip," Thomas said with a chuckle. "Come on, let's have a drink." As Thomas led Greg away to the study, I turned to Jack, my voice low. "We're running out of time." "I know," Jack said, his face grim. "But I'll figure something out." That night, Jack came to me with a plan. "I'll talk to Greg," he said, his voice resolute, one last time. "No," I said, panic rising in my chest. "You can't trust him." "I'm not asking for his trust," Jack replied, his voice steady. "But if I don't do something, he'll ruin everything." Despite my protests, Jack left the house that night, determined to confront Greg and put an end to it, to his threats. He met Greg at a bar far away from our house, hoping for some semblance of privacy. "This is your last chance," Greg said, sipping his drink with an air of finality. "Leave town or I'll destroy both of you." Jack leaned in, his voice cold. "You think you can control me or Ava? You're pathetic." Greg's smirk faltered and he leaned in closer. "Careful, kid. You don't want to make an enemy of me." Jack didn't back down. "You already are." Greg stormed out of the bar, his threats lingering in the air. When Jack returned home, he was pale but determined. "It's done," he said. "What did you do?" I asked, fear in my voice. "Nothing illegal," Jack replied, though his tone was evasive. But the peace didn't last. The following morning, Thomas received an anonymous email with damning evidence, enough to unravel everything. Thomas stormed into the kitchen, holding his phone. his face pale with fury. Ava barked, slamming the phone on the counter. "What is this?" I froze, my eyes darting to the phone screen. The subject line was ominous. "The truth about your wife and your son." Below it, a series of photos captured stolen moments between Jack and me. The captions were even worse, filled with venom and accusations. "This has to be a mistake," I stammered, my voice betraying me. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he read the email. "Don't insult my intelligence, Ava. I've known something was off for weeks. Now I know why." Jack entered the room then, his face going pale as he saw the scene unfolding. "What's going on?" Jack asked cautiously. Thomas turned on him, his anger boiling over. "You know exactly what's going on. You've been sneaking around with my wife." "My wife?" Jack stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Thomas, just listen to me." "Don't you dare tell me to listen," Thomas shouted. "I welcomed you into my home, and this is how you repay me." "It's not that simple," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with tension. "Not that simple?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "You seduced her, didn't you? Manipulated her the same way you manipulate everyone else." "That's not what happened," I said, my voice trembling. "Thomas, please, let's talk about this." Thomas cut me off, his voice cold. "I trusted you, Ava. I gave you everything, and you threw it all away for him." Before I could react, Thomas turned back to Jack. "You're no son of mine. Pack your things and get out of my house." Before Jack could say anything, the doorbell rang. I froze, dreading the worst. When Thomas opened the door, Sabrina stood there with a smug expression. "Sabrina," Jack asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "I came to deliver the rest of the truth," Sabrina said as she walked past Thomas into the house. "What truth?" Thomas demanded, his voice sharp. Sabrina pulled out her phone and played an audio recording for everyone to hear. It was Jack's voice, low and urgent. "Greg needs to back off. If he doesn't, I'll make sure he regrets it." The room fell silent as the recording finished. Thomas turned to Jack, his gaze filled with suspicion. "What does this mean?" "It's not what it sounds like," Jack said quickly, his voice defensive. Sabrina smirked. "Oh, I think it's exactly what it sounds like. Jack's been playing games, Thomas. With Greg, with Ava, with everyone." Thomas turned to me, his face filled with betrayal. "Is this true? Did you know about this?" "I didn't," I said, but the words felt hollow. "Don't lie to me, Ava," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Jack stepped in between us. "Leave her out of this," he said firmly. "This is all about her," Thomas snapped. "You don't think I see that?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Maybe it has, but you drove her to it. You pursued your career with disregard for her." "Don't lecture me about my marriage," Thomas growled. The tension in the room reached its peak, and for a moment I thought someone would strike. Just then, Greg entered the house without knocking, his expression wild. "What's going on here?" Thomas demanded. Greg pointed at Jack. He threatened me. He said he'd ruin me if I didn't keep quiet. Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You've been blackmailing us, Greg. Avoid portraying yourself as the victim." "Blackmail," Thomas repeated, disbelief written across his face. Greg expressed his dissatisfaction with venom, as you are entitled to be informed about the events that have transpired within your residence. The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping, accusations flying. Finally, Thomas slammed his fist on the counter. "Enough," he shouted. "I don't care who started this. I want all of you out of my house now." I felt the weight of his words crushing me. "Thomas, please." "Save it," he said coldly. "I'll have the divorce papers ready by the end of the week." Jack's face darkened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned to me, his eyes full of regret. "I'll wait for you outside," he said softly before leaving the room. I stood on the porch, watching Jack load his car, the ache in my chest growing. This wasn't how I wanted it to end. It doesn't have to end, Jack said quietly as he turned to me. I hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I can't, I said finally, tears streaming down my face. I've already lost too much. Jack nodded, his jaw clenched. I understand, he said. Without another word, he got into his car and drove away, leaving me standing in the cold. In the days that followed, the fallout consumed me. Clara called repeatedly, concerned, but I couldn't face her. Thomas moved into a hotel, leaving the house eerily empty. I spent my nights staring out at the garden, replaying every choice that had led me to this point. The passion, the risks, the lies. They had all come at a cost I wasn't sure I could bear. But despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. For the first time in years, I felt alive, even if it had all ended in ruin.